last week when we gathered for worship, we had a reading from the book of Lamentations, that book that conveys the sorrow of the Jewish people who'd been dragged off to captivity in Babylon. But last week's reading, as much as it was a reading about sorrow, sort of turned a corner at the end where it said, "The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the souls that seek him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord." Today, we turn from the book of Lamentations to the book of Jeremiah, which was written at about the same time, but where Lamentations was written in Babylon by a people living under the boot of the Babylonians. Jeremiah was writing from Jerusalem, from the city that had been besieged by the Babylonian army, that had been knocked halfway down, that had had the temple destroyed. It was just the shell of what it had once been. It wasn't exactly a great place to be either. But Jeremiah writes to those people who had been dragged off, who had been enslaved, and he speaks a word to them that's a little bit different. He tells them that they should put down roots. He tells them to build homes and live in them. He tells them to plant gardens. He tells them to get married and have children, and to celebrate when their children get married and have children of their own. He tells those captives that they should pray not for their deliverance, but for the welfare of the place where they are. It's an odd kind of thing to say to people who are lamenting their loss. It's an odd thing to say to people who are dwelling in captivity, to people who don't really have a home anymore. When I was a kid, well, I guess technically even now, I was an Army brat. My father was career military. He served during Vietnam and got out for just a brief while and then went back into the Army. He realized that that uniform that he had said he didn't want to wear anymore actually had a bit more appeal than he had thought at the time. Now, when I compare my life growing up with other service juniors, as they like to call them these days, because Army brat just doesn't seem like they could call somebody, I guess. But when I compare my life to other people who grew up in military families, there's a major difference. Most of the service kids that you talk to tell about moving all the time. They talk about living in North Carolina one year and in Germany another year, about going to Okinawa and then California, about always being in motion, about never being able to establish permanent community. Now, I was fortunate in that my father, though full-time military, was assigned to a National Guard unit. So he was the full-time guy who held things together so that all of the one weekend a month and 2 weeks every summer folks could be part-time. My brother and I then never had to move the way so many other military dependents did. We got to grow up in the same community, with the same friends and going to the same church. For us, it was easy to be grounded. But for a lot of my military brat peers, flourishing was hard. It's hard when you don't have a place that you can permanently call home, when you're waiting for the next transfer order to come in. But that's very much what was going on with those Jewish folks in Babylon. They hadn't put down roots. They were hoping for that transfer back to Jerusalem, if you will. They were looking for freedom. They were looking for a new beginning. And so Jeremiah's words came to them as something of a shock. Don't look to that next transfer. Put down roots where you are now. Be present. Pray for the welfare of your city. It's hard when you're not home. Now, Jesus wasn't home. He was traveling. He was on that borderland between Samaria and Galilee, making his way down to Jerusalem. And as he made his way, he came across a group of 10 lepers. You know the story. Not only was it read to us, but we've heard it over and over through the years. I'm sure that you probably sat in the same Sunday school class that I did, where we heard the story of how Jesus healed these 10 lepers and how only one of them came back to say thank you. If I recall correctly, in that Sunday school class where we all sat, this scripture passage was distilled down to a single, simple moral. Right? Wasn't it? It was, make sure you say thanks. As if that were the point. Now, it's important to be polite. You send those thank you notes when you get your birthday presents. My grandmother made sure that I learned that one early. Of course we do. But that's really not what Jesus is doing here when he asks the question about, weren't 10 of these healed and only one has come back to say thank you? That's not what the gospel writer was trying to convey. He had a much bigger story in mind. So let's just take a moment to walk through it. First, Jesus is traveling through this borderland, a place that on a map could certainly have a line drawn saying this is Israel, this is Samaria, but in reality is a place where the cultures were rubbing up against each other, where the cultural mix was rather thick. And in this borderland, the Jews, the good guys in most of the stories in Scripture, were on one side of the border, and the Samaritans, those bad guys, as they were always depicted, were over on the other side. The Samaritans were the ones who, during the period of the Babylonian exile, had intermarried with the Babylonian occupiers. The Jews on the southern border were the ones who had been carted off to captivity and held fast to their purity. And so you have these two cultures playing against one another. So Jesus is going to this borderland and he encounters 10 lepers, people with skin conditions of one form or another, probably not what we would call leprosy today, but a skin condition that kept them from being welcomed into society, that kept them pushed off to the sides because that might be contagious. And so in this border region where it's easy to be betwixt and between, we have this group of 10 who fit in neither society due to their illness. As Jesus is traveling, they call out to him, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." And Jesus, rather than laying hands on them and healing them right there, tells them, "Go, show yourselves to the priests." Go, show yourselves to the priests. Now it helps if we realize that in Jesus' day, the priests were the arbiters of who was clean and who was unclean. Whether that rash that you had was something that would keep you out, or if it was something that was no big deal. They were the ones who would look at you and say, "You've been healed. Welcome back to community." So Jesus tells the 10, "Go, show yourselves to the priests so that you can be declared clean." And off they run, all 10 of them. And on the way they're healed. Their skin that had been patchy is now clear. And 9 of them continue on their way to the temple to show themselves to the priests. But one turns around, prostrates himself at Jesus' feet, and gives thanks for the healing. And that one was the Samaritan. Jesus, of course, then asks a string of questions. Were not 10 made clean? But the other 9, where are they? Was none of them found to return and give thanks? Except for this foreigner? And finally, Jesus tells the now healed Samaritan, get up and go on your way, for your faith has made you well. Now, I have no doubt whatsoever that the 9 Jewish former lepers followed Jesus' instructions to the letter. He told them to go and show themselves to the priests, and that's what they did. They were declared to be clean. They were able to re-enter society. They could go home and see their spouses and their children. They could interact with people in the marketplace. And I'm sure they told their story, telling the priest that Jesus, the traveling rabbi, had sent them. Telling their family that they had been healed by the grace of God. But then they settled right back down to the lives that they'd always known as part of that majority culture. But the Samaritan was different. That foreigner living in the borderlands, not quite fitting in because of his religion and his ethnicity, he's the one who turns out to be the faithful one. The one whose gratitude reminds all of us that more often than not it is the outsiders who embody God's grace even more than those who look or sound or worship like the cultural majority. For a long time, really ever since Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, Christians have believed that we have a place at the center of Western society. We've expected that society will do what we demand. Now, I have to tell you, I'm one of those folks who believes that Constantine was probably the worst thing that ever happened to Christianity. Because once we came to power, once we became the dominant cultural and religious force, we started thinking that we were supposed to be in charge, rather than to be in community with others, rather than being in dialogue as part of a world that is bigger than ourselves. Of course, now the pendulum is swinging the other direction. We're seeing a demographic shift not only in the United States, but globally. We Christians are not that powerful force that we once were. We can't impose a Christian worldview on society. It just doesn't cut it in today's world. I don't know if you've come across the book yet. It's in my to-read list. I came across an article about it in the Atlantic magazine not long ago. The book is The End of White Christian America by Robert P. Jones. And I found that it's a noteworthy article that I was reading pointing to a book that I think challenges us in a lot of ways. You see, back in 2008, 54% of America was white and Christian. Now, there were white folks who weren't Christian. There were Christians who aren't white. But 54% sort of fit that overlap in the Big Venn diagram. And over the last 8 years, it's gone from 54% to 45%. That's a massive change in not much time. And some Christians are looking at this as the end of the world. They're reacting with anger. They're reacting with fear. They're reacting with a sense of nostalgia, wanting to make America something again, something that it used to be, or something that they at least imagined that it once was. But you know, that's not who we are. We are the people who hold on to that old thing and try and make it what the world is now. Instead, we're much more like those Hebrew people living in exile in Babylon, who heard the word of the prophet saying, don't long for what used to be. Don't dream of a day when, but instead engage where you are now. Put down roots. Build houses. Plant gardens. Get married and love each other. Celebrate when your children find love. Dance. Celebrate the goodness of God and pray for the welfare of the city where you are. Pray for the welfare of the city where you are. These are challenging days. We hear competing visions, even within Christianity. Some seeking to go back, some seeking to move forward. Some looking for that distant utopia where everything will be perfect. And if we ever reach that point, it'll be nice. But we all know that reality, don't we? Here we are with our feet in the muck and in the mire, in a world where we are not the dominant force anymore. But you know there's good news there too. Because that frees us up to be authentic. It lets us be a force for good. It lets us be like those people so long ago that gathered with Jesus, who weren't the state religion. Though here in Connecticut we had our little time of being the state religion, didn't we? No, it lets us be like those folks who are part of a minority movement, changing society a little bit at a time, reaching out in love, sharing grace, working for justice. Not thinking that we had it as a right, but instead as a mission. There's something that happens when we change our perspective, when we realize that we aren't the ones to be catered to, but that we're the ones who are called to do the holy work. The work of planting and building and praying. May God then bless us and fill our hearts with gratitude as we move through this borderland, as we follow faithfully the call of